I'm very pleased to present this material to this distinguished audience of colleagues because it was meant as a survey of some of the results I have achieved in this area. It's also built with some information that for some of you will be absolutely, sort of superfluous. But I want to build a stage also for those who are not necessarily, au fait with the topic. So the company you keep, of course, this is an immediate reminder of good companies, bad companies, and I want to say something about both of them. I'm going to start with the general presentation of Neologicism as a foundation of mathematics. Then I'm going to get immediately into this part-whole relation and one-one intuitions about counting. Present a result by Zermelo, which is a key result for some of the work we're going to look at. Then I'm going to talk about some of my work on the good company, some of my work on the bad company, and finally, some applications, recent applications for coming in the review of symbolic logic in work with Stuart Shapiro and Benjamin Siskind on the axiom of choice in second order logic. We will see that the setup for applications of that sort is very similar to the setup for neo-logicist abstraction principle. So it's an interesting kind of application to something different from the neo-logicist program. Then a conclusion and a biography. So Neologicism emerges in the contemporary debate in philosophy of mathematics with Crispin Wright's book, Frege's Conceptions of Numbers as Objects in 1983. And Wright's project was to show the viability of a philosophy of mathematics that could preserve the key tenets of Frege's approach. Now, prima facie, this could have appeared as an impossible task. After all, Frege's foundational system, as presented in the Foundations of Arithmetic and in the final formulation in Basic Laws of Arithmetic, relied on the use of extensions codified by means of the notorious Basic Law 5. In the latter work, a law that was shown by Russell to lead to contradiction. Now, Basic Law 5 postulates the existence of a function delta that maps the concepts into the objects of the domain in such a way as to satisfy the following statement. And I won't repeat it because Basic Law 5 is known to all of you. Now, it's easy to show that Basic Law 5 yields an unrestricted comprehension axiom, which in turn yields the existence of Russell's paradoxical set. Now, Frege himself and a few others after him tried to tweak Basic Law 5, but with no real success. I mean, maybe it could be made consistent with the existence of one object, but it wasn't really anything good for developing arithmetic until Wright's book. And so until Wright's book, Frege's foundational project was really not considered viable anymore. Now, Wright's approach emerged as a combination of a powerful technical result and a host of philosophical arguments. The technical result consisted in the observation that in the Foundations of Arithmetic, Frege used extensions in order to prove what is now called Hume's principle, okay? So the number of x and y is identical if the objects that fall under them stand in one-to-one correspondence. Now, Hume's principle provides a criterion of identity for the operator number of. It states that the number of x and the number of y are identical if and only if there is a one-to-one correspondence between the objects falling under x and those falling under y. Now, it is important to remark that just as in the case of Basic Law 5, the right-hand side of the biconditional can be expressed in purely logical terms. What Wright and later even Boulos and Heck showed was that once Hume's principle was established, Frege did not have any further use for extensions and proceeded in the Foundations of Arithmetic to provide an outline of how to prove from Hume's principle the basic axioms for second-order arithmetic. The technical result, thus, was Wright's detailed reconstruction of how to derive within second-order logic the basic axioms of second-order arithmetic from Hume's principle and definitions. Now, it could still be objected that this is a far cry from the logicism championed by Frege. After all, HP does not look like a logical axiom. Now, Wright agrees with this, but is Frege was interested in logicism in order to prove, contra Kant, the analyticity of arithmetic. And Wright's philosophical point was that this part of the Fregean project could be vindicated by taking HP on board and arguing that it was analytic or definitional of the number of operator or something akin to analytic. Obviously, this is where much of the philosophical debate has focused, but that discussion is actually irrelevant for my goals today, in the sense that all the results I'm going to give you are orthogonal in a way to the particular debate on what exactly is the analyticity of Hume's principle. Now, rather, what is important is that the discussion has led to a detailed scrutiny of abstraction principles, of which BL5 and HP are the two most famous instances. Indeed, one of the first objections to accepting Hume's principle was an argument, the first form of bad company objection, which questioned the legitimacy of using definitions such as Hume's principle, arguing that something problematic must be going on here, as shown by the fact that BL5 has exactly the same definitional form, but gives rise to contradiction. This led to the first requirement of a long series to come. There is a huge industry there for separating good from bad abstractions, namely consistency. Thus, much of the philosophical work in neologicism is aimed at explaining what is spatial, epistemologically, ontologically, or otherwise, about good abstraction principles that allows them to provide the foundations for mathematics along the neologicist lines. And that completes the overall survey of, so to speak, the background material. Now for part-whole relations and one-one intuitions on counting. In two new sciences, Galileo presented a paradox of infinity, one horn of which rested on a part-whole intuition. The collection of squares of natural numbers is properly included in the collection of natural numbers. Thus, the number or numerosity of the former must be strictly less than that of the latter. More formally, if A is strictly included in B, then the numerosity of A must be strictly less than the numerosity of B, which itself yields that n of A must be, the numerosity of A must be different from the numerosity of B. On the other hand, and this is the second horn of the dilemma, we can associate univocally the squares of natural numbers with the natural numbers. And hence, the two collections have the same number or numerosity. More formally, if there is a one-to-one correspondence between A and B, then the numerosity of A equals the numerosity of B. The two intuitions lead to a contradiction. Of course, I'm using here numerosity to be, as it were, non-committal about, what exactly is going to be this measure of counting. We'll see later that there are theories of numerosities in a technical sense that take a specific approach to counting in this context. Now, the two intuitions lead to a contradiction in that, according to the first, the squares are less numerous than the natural numbers and thus have different numerosity. And according to the second, they have exactly the same numerosity. Now, in the history of philosophy and mathematics, there have been defenders of the part-whole principle, most notably Bolzano. Bolzano is really amazing. When you go to the paradoxes of the infinite, you find Bolzano, 30, 40 years before Cantor, already arguing against Cantor's solution, telling you, look, it is true that infinite sets have this very special property that you can put them in one-to-one correspondence with subsets of themselves. And then he goes on to say, but don't make the mistake of thinking that that's going to give you a criterion of size. So it's definitely someone who wants to preserve part-whole when it came to counting at infinity. He was unable to do so because the mathematics involved was beyond his reach. But it was the second principle based on one-to-one correspondence that was enshrined in Cantorian set theory, through the notion of cardinal number as the proper way to generalize counting from finite to the infinite. One reason for the dominance of the Cantorian solution was that no mathematical implementation of part-whole that extended to infinite sets seemed possible. Now, recent work in the theory of numerosities by Benci, Di Nastro, and Forti has shown that it is possible to implement an assignment of numerosities to sets that preserves the part-whole principle, namely the property that if A is strictly included in B, the numerosity of A is strictly less than the numerosity of B. Now, the context in which this construction of numerosities takes place is that of ordinary set-theoretic mathematics. And maybe I shouldn't say ordinary in that there is quite a lot of mathematical machinery that is needed, which is independent of Zermelo-Frankel with choice. For instance, the existence of Ramsey ultrafilters, but it's theoretical mathematics. Now, the system of numerosities can be seen as a refinement of Cantorian cardinalities. If two sets have the same numerosity, then they have the same Cantorian cardinality. However, the converse doesn't hold. For instance, the numerosities of the square numbers is different from the numerosity of the natural numbers, as it should be, given that we are implementing a part-whole principle. But their cardinality is exactly the same. And by the way, on the finite, the two approaches completely coincide. So numerosities and cardinalities give you exactly the same finite area arithmetic. Now, since the relation of equivalence among sets induced by the theory of numerosities is much finer than the one yielding Cantorian cardinalities, it turns out that one needs many more numerosities, and this many more is spelled out in terms of ordinary set theory, than the objects whose collections are being counted. For instance, a theory of numerosities for arbitrary collections of natural numbers requires at least uncountably many numerosities, because it makes such fine distinctions that you need a lot of numbers to account for those. By contrast, a theory of cardinality for arbitrary collections of natural numbers requires only countably many cardinalities. Now, in this observation is contained the essence of an important result, which will show the impossibility in a Fregean setting of implementing the part-whole principle for operators defined by abstraction. Abstraction principles in a Fregean context, we could say, compress the concepts into the domain of objects according to the equivalence relation on concepts. When one looks at the situation set theoretically, this corresponds to the idea of mapping the power set of a set X into the set X itself, according to an equivalence relation defined among the elements of the power set. In the case of BL5, this relation is the extensional identity of the sets. In the case of HP, is the existence of a one-to-one mapping between the sets. So in a Fregean setting, an abstraction operator is an operator delta on concepts such that delta X equals delta Y if and only if X, E, Y, where E is some equivalence relation on concepts. Now, what would it mean to say that delta satisfies a part-whole constraint? We say that an abstraction operator satisfies part-whole if the following condition holds, and it's really a minimal condition on part-whole. The abstraction operator preserves the subset relation. So for all X and Y, if X is strictly included in Y, then the delta, the operator, tells you that the delta X must be different from the delta Y. Okay, so it keeps track of the subset relation. And of course, all of this stuff is definable in second-order logic. Now, part-whole does not have a standard model in the Fregean setting, i.e. a model of the form X, power set of X, F, for an F that sends the power set of X into X, where the power set is the full power set of X. I previously pointed out in my book, for instance, Abstraction in Infinity, that an old result by Zermelo, which has incredible generality, shows that for any set X and for any function F, if F sends the entire power set of X into X itself, then there must be two sets, A and B, included in the original set X, such that A is strictly included in B, but the function collapses their values. So that shows that part-whole cannot be preserved in this kind of Fregean context. Since Frege systems are second-order systems, and so Gödel's results apply, this unsatisfiability, so the lack of models, does not automatically lead to a formal refutation in second-order logic. Anecdotally, it was my attempt to see whether a part-whole alternative to Hume's principle could be formulated that led me to explore the company that HP and BL5 keep. So my original plan was to say, can I do something like Crispin Wright did, but with a different abstraction that preserves part whole? And that turned out to be an impossible task. So this is what led me, though, to the concept of a good companion of HP. So now I'm going to start talking about the good company stuff. Later, I will turn to the bad company. So a good abstraction is one in which the right-hand side is purely logical. It shares all the good formal properties of HP, and I mean consistency, stability, superstability, anything that anyone has come up with. And I think Cook 2012 was the most updated article on those properties in order to preserve the goodness of Hume's principle and get rid of the rogues forming the bad company. So for me, a good abstraction is one that has exactly all these good properties that so far have been individuated for Hume's principle. And in addition, it allows us to prove the axioms of second-order arithmetic. Of course, the first example is Hume's principle, is the one we want to preserve at all costs. But here is another one that is historically relevant because Peano formulated it in explicit opposition to Cantor. When formalized, basically it works like this. You have an abstraction operator that identifies infinite sets in one single equivalence class and works like Hume's principle on the finite sets. So you just have one infinity. That's basically what it is. But on the finite sets, it works like Hume's principle. George Boulos was doing some model theoretic studies on various types of cofinite and infinite sets and so on. But out of those studies, you can actually develop an infinite number of abstraction principles. And this work in the following way. On the finite, everything works like in Hume's principle. Okay, you just use one-to-one correspondence. Then you put in the same class all those infinite sets that are cofinite. And finally, you have another class that puts in the same class all the infinite sets that are not cofinite. Okay, so you basically have the natural number structure and 2 points at infinity dealing with these two extra classes. And I'm just listing this. This could be parameterized by an arbitrary natural number if I take care to specify what the size of the cofinite sets are. So if I individuate them as having exactly size n, out of this general principle, I get infinitely many of them. And I have other principles of this sort, but I don't want to list all of them. It doesn't really matter. What counts is that I have infinitely many of them. Now, of course, right, you could be saying, well, it's easy to come up with abstraction principles, right? Another thing is to show that they do real work and that they have the properties that make them interesting. So the first abstraction is our paradigm good abstraction. That's Hume's principle. The second abstraction formalizes this intuition by Peano. The third goes back to Boulos' model theoretic investigations of HP. And as I say, it's possible to parameterize all of these to n so that we get infinitely many abstraction principles. Now, in 1997, Richard Heck developed a proof-theoretic analysis of Hume's principle and weaker versions of it. In particular, he investigated Hume's principle restricted to finite sets and came up with something called finite Hume principle, which reads as follows. For every x and y, if either x is finite or y is finite, then the number of x equals the number of y if and only if they are in one-to-one correspondence. Notice this or between finite x or finite y. There are weaker forms of this stuff which have an and in there. And the stuff with the and is of no strength whatsoever. But when you put an or, things are more interesting. Now, it showed that within second order logic, plus definitions of zero, predecessor and natural number, from Hume's finite principle, one obtains the axioms of PA2. Now, in general, the following holds. Consider the weaker principle I was telling you about, where you have and between finite x and finite y. If that by itself, it's very weak. It really doesn't give you much. However, if you add to WHP the condition that whenever x is finite and y is infinite, then the abstraction operator recognizes that by saying that they get different abstracta, then the abstraction principle satisfies HPF. In other words, let's see if I can. If I take this condition, sorry, I need a pen. This additional constraint, I add VHP to it, well, then I'm going to get this. And that allows me to derive the axioms of second order arithmetic. Okay, so, and now it's easy to verify that all the abstraction principles I gave you, and there were infinitely many, satisfy this weak condition with VHP and the extra condition for keeping track of finite and infinite sets. Thus, I can infer from each one of those the other principle HPF. And so from each one of them, I can prove second order arithmetic. So we now have a plethora of abstraction principles from which the axioms of second order arithmetic can be derived. Another way to put it is that there are infinitely many Frege's theorems, depending on the starting point. And this is the result, which is at the core what I call the good company objection. Now, until the time I began investigating the good companions of HP, it was generally thought that HP was unique in his ability to generate the axioms of second order arithmetic. Now, what these results show is that there are infinitely many good companions of HP, and that such principles agree on the assignments to finite concepts, but diverge rather drastically on infinite concepts. And this is the company that HP keeps. But now one can begin putting pressure on the analyticity of HP by raising what I like to call the good company objection. Now, Hume's principle shares a great deal of epistemically key properties with the other abstraction principles I listed previously. PP, BP, and its infinitely many parameterized versions, they're all consistent, mutually compatible, they're all in good standing, hence the word good company. From each one of them, we can derive a suitable version of the axioms of PA2. Any argument in favor of the a prioricity or analyticity of HP would seem to also apply to any other one of them. Hence, both principles, or all of them, are analytic and a priori. Thus, they are both true, but they contradict each other, for they do so on the assignment of cardinality to infinite sets. Okay, but of course, is it right to say that? Can we really argue in that way? Now, in these two books of mine, I discussed at length the objection by distinguishing three possible varieties of neologicism and how they are affected by the good company objection. Since my goal in this talk is just to give an overview of the formal results, I do not have the time here to rehearse the subtle dialectic connected to the good company objection, but I'm delighted to report, maybe I shouldn't say this because Crispin and other people are in the audience, but it was true as of 2014. let me put it this way, that the objection has been discussed in a constructive way by many neologicists in reviews of my books. Actually, that is a true fact. So at least that part I won't have to put up for grabs. And so with this, I conclude the discussion of the company HP keeps and move to the company that basic lo-fi keeps. Okay, so as a way of summary is this idea that there is no uniqueness of Hume's principle. There are lots of different principles. They all agree on the finite concepts, but they widely disagree on what we're going to assign to infinite concepts. And situations like this in the history and philosophy of mathematics have been plenty. Think of what happened to the synthetic a priori in Kant once it was pressured from the emergence of non-Euclidean geometries. One way around that is to retrench and to say, all right, we went too far. Let's just talk about the finite sets. Another one is to insist that only Hume's principle is the correct one and the others have to be given up. So there are many possibilities here. Okay, now for the bad company. Now, a bad company objection shows that the form of HP that would seem to make it analytic and a priori is shared by other abstraction principles, which turn out to be either inconsistent, basic law 5, or incompatible with HP, for they can only be true on a domain of different cardinality than the one that HP requires. In the easiest case, we have the parity principle or the nuisance principle. And 3, have other defects such as arrogance, lack of modesty, and so on and so forth. So no amount of effort has been spared to come up with conditions that would separate the good principles from the bad ones. Now, basic law 5, however, has been the only natural example of an operator giving rise to inconsistency. I'm restricting this to monadic concepts. I deal also with ordinals and well orderings in another part of my work. But this focus on basic law 5 has had as a consequence of making it appear as a sort of monster in an otherwise regular universe of abstraction principles free from this pathology. And in the following, I will focus on the consistency objection, which is the one that relates to basic law 5. And I will show, and this is joint work with Benjamin Siskind that came out in 2019, that the abstraction operator defined by basic law 5 is no monster, or in any case, that it is part of a family of inconsistent abstraction principles. This will give us an insight into the company that basic law 5 keeps. But in order to explain the background for this result, we need to talk about the part-whole relation among concepts and their extensions. So recall that an abstraction operator delta satisfies part-whole if the following condition holds. For every concepts x and y or sets, x strictly included in y implies that delta x different from delta y. Notice that the extension operator characterized by BL5 trivially satisfies the part-whole principle. For if A is strictly included in B, then A and B are extensionally different, and so the extension operator assigns them different abstracta. The result I would like to present to you is that any abstraction operator satisfying part-whole is formally refutable in second-order logic, plus the additional symbol, of course, for the abstraction operator. Now, let us say something more about the foundational situation with basic law 5. The proof of its inconsistency relies on impredicative comprehension principles for the expanded language. But BL5 is consistent with predicative comprehension. In fact, the bad company problem generated by inconsistent abstraction principles disappears at the level of predicative abstraction. Sean Walsh, improving on result of others, has shown that the theory of all purely second-order definable abstraction principles, so whose right-hand side is an equivalence relation provably in second-order logic, is consistent with delta 1-1 comprehension in the expanded language, and indeed full comprehension for pure second-order formulas. But the above results already suggest that a formal refutation of the existence of abstraction operators satisfying the part-whole condition in pure second-order logic must use at least pi11 comprehension, right? So here the point is that in order to get the proof of the inconsistency of basic law 5, we need impredicative comprehension. But at the level of predicative comprehension, no trouble arises. So given that basic law 5 satisfies part whole, it is to be expected that any proof that refutes part whole is going to have to go beyond predicative comprehension principles. So we work in the signature of second order logic with the additional function symbol delta, whose arguments are monadic predicates, i.e. concepts in Fregean jargon, and whose values are objects. To show that some abstraction principles are inconsistent, we show that the negation of certain sentences in this language are provable, keeping track of the amount of comprehension used in the proofs. Now, the derivability sign, the term style, denotes provability in second-order logic with just the usual natural deduction rules for quantifiers and connectives, plus substitution rules for first and second-order terms, including terms involving delta. We also assume extensionality for predicates, though the results go through also without this, with some care. And in particular, we do not assume any amount of choice and flag any comprehension assumption in the theorems. So we're interested in using syntactic complexity classes to give a stratification of comprehension principles, since we don't have the existence of a pairing function in our general context. And this makes a big difference when you do comparisons to reverse mathematics or systems of second order number theory. We need to allow finite strings of quantifiers instead of single quantifiers in the definition of our syntactic classes. A term is either an object variable X or something of the form delta big X for a unary predicate variable X. A formula is atomic if it has the form S equals T or R of T for S and T terms, and T an n tuple of terms where R is an n-ary predicate variable. So here is the stratification I have been telling you about. It will remind you of the ordinary stratification that you encounter when you do second order number theory or analysis. But in fact, because we don't have choice, things are much more delicate than they are in the ordinary setup. So FO is the smallest class of formulas, which contains the atomic formulas and is closed under Boolean combinations and object quantification. Sigma 1,1 adds a string of existential quantifiers over concepts. Because we don't have pairing functions, we have to allow for an arbitrary n of strings. Pi11 does the same for universal quantifiers. And then sigma 1,2 will put a string of existential quantifiers over a pi11 formula. Well, comprehension principles are stated exactly as you would expect. Perhaps, the delta 1,1 comprehension, which you see here, will say that if you have two formulas and they are equivalent, one being sigma 1,1 and one being pi11, then we're going to have the comprehension principle for that phi. And the comprehension principle for any phi is simply this. There is an R such that for all V, RV, if and only if that formula holds of V. There are some basic results that are like in the standard setup. Every pi11 formula is equivalent to the negation of a sigma 1 formula, and this implies that pi11 CA and sigma 1,1 CA are actually equivalent comprehension principles. Okay, with the above in place, we can start by stating the precise amount of comprehension principle required in second order logic to refute basic law 5. Here's the first theorem. Just with pi11 CA, you can refute basic law 5. So this hypothesis on the comprehension principle needed has no improvement among the natural comprehension principle, since, as it is mentioned before, BL5 plus delta 1,1 CA is consistent. Okay, so that's where the level at which we get into trouble. Okay, Now, part-all principles. We define the following sentence in the expanded language. It's just a part-all principle that we have already seen. And what it says is that part-all delta respects part-all. Speaking set theoretically, each set has a delta value, which is distinct from all of the delta values of its proper subsets. Of course, PW is not literally an abstraction principle, but there are abstraction principles which deductively imply PW. So the following theorem gives a new proof of the inconsistency of basic law 5, and the first proof of the inconsistency of the other abstraction principles whose operator satisfies part-all that were previously discussed in the literature. I haven't given you examples of this, but one I played around with at the beginning of my experimentation with this stuff was consider an abstraction principle that works like Hume's principle on the finite sets and like basic law 5 on the infinite sets. Okay, that abstraction principle satisfies part-all. And it will be refutable by this general theorem that I'm giving you now, which is that sigma 1, 2 CA proves the negation of part-all. So in second order logic with the extra symbol for the delta, assuming that the delta satisfies is an abstraction operator, you get the refutation of part-all. How do you get there? How do you prove such a thing? When Zermelo, so basically what we did was to reproduce a part of Zermelo's proof of the equivalence between the axiom of choice and the well-ordering theorem that is kind of buried. I mean, this main result I'm using, it's kind of buried in that proof. And it was Kanamori who brought it out vividly in this article from the late 1990s on Zermelo. The idea is that you have to build witnesses, X and Y, to the failure of part-all by transfinite induction, right? But transfinite induction is something that we have in set theory, we don't have in second order logic. So you have to find a way to do something that corresponds to transfinite induction with mere second order logic. And I'm not going to give you the proof, which takes about 3 pages in the paper, in the 2019 paper, but this is the informal argument for showing how you defeat part-all. So you have this abstraction operator to begin with, right? And let's look at what object our abstraction operator assigns to the empty set to begin with. So you're looking at delta of the empty set. Okay, that's going to be some x0. Now we put this x0 in Y, in the set Y we're constructing. And now we ask, well, take a look at that set with just x0 and look at what delta does to it. It's going to give it a value. Well, if it's going to be, again, x0, then we're done. We have found 2 sets, the empty set and the singleton x0, which will receive the same value by delta, but one is a proper subset of the other. If not, we keep going. In other words, delta of x0 will be some x1, which is not in x0, and we put x1 again in Y. So Y is growing. Now we look at the delta of x0, x1. Well, either it is x0, or it is x1, or it is some other value. If one of the first 2 cases holds, we're done. If not, we keep going. And so it goes. And we keep adding to Y. Now, in the end of this process, right, this is the transfinite induction, we get some well-ordered set Y, such that for all proper initial segments Z of Y, delta Z gives me the next element in the well-ordering of Y. But then delta Y is in Y, since otherwise we could continue building Y, adding a new element, delta Y. By construction, delta Y got into Y by being the delta value of some proper initial segment X of Y, i.e. delta Y equals delta X. And so we found X and Y violating part-all. So this is the set theoretical reasoning that you have to mimic in second-order logic plus the abstraction operator to get the result we have. And the sigma 1, 2, right, is born out of the fact that you have to construct this existential set, this existential relation. Which is the y, sorry, the set y. And in order to make this work in our setting, we just need to see that we can describe this y in a sigma 1, 2 way. And it's a pretty good mouthful. I'll just read it, but I'm not expecting you will see all of it in one go. It is the field of the unique maximal well-ordered R, such that for all proper initial segments S of R, the at least upper bound of S is the delta value of the field of S. And as I say, the proof is, takes some time, and I'm not going to reproduce it here. Now, we can show that there are infinitely many abstraction principles that are refutable in second-order logic. Okay, so this is on the way to show that, again, basic law 5 is not a single monster, but rather there are infinitely many bad abstractions that are inconsistent because they satisfy part all. So here is how we construct them. Let's singleton X. This is the formula in second order logic saying that X holds exactly of one object. And this is our way to speak about singletons and define this new equivalence relation for singletons that basically says the following. In the same equivalence class, put all singletons. And if two things are not singletons, put them in the same equivalent class only if they satisfy extensional identity or equality, which means we're using basic law 5 on everything except the singletons. It's easy to show that that equivalence relation satisfies part all. Why? Well, because if X is strictly included in Y, then at most one or X and Y is a singleton. And so they end up in different equivalence classes according to this relation. Similarly, for each N, we can do the same thing. We can define purely logically what it means for exactly N objects to fall under a concept. We express that relation by saying that the cardinality of X is N. And therefore, we can create, again, a new equivalence relation now based on the equality up to size N. So if things are of size N, we put them in the same equivalence class. If they're not, we use basic law 5. And with a little bit of reflection on the size of the cardinality required, you can in fact show that each one of these things, it's an equivalence relation. 36, I believe. Let's see. Yeah. And so using our previous work on equivalence relation, we can now show that when you apply abstraction to this equivalence relation, you get for C1, you do abstraction on the equivalence relation on singletons, and for Cn, you do it on the N equivalence relation. And so we show that there are infinitely many abstraction principles that are refutable in second order logic. So each Ci defines an abstraction operator that provably satisfies part all, thus by our main theorem, sigma 1 to Ca proves the negation of all of those abstraction principles. Okay, 36, 37. Okay, I'm now finishing. It's 1:53. We should be done in about 5 minutes. I want to mention this recent work that Stuart Shapiro and Benny Sisking and I did, because it's an interesting application of this work. So the proof of the negation of the part whole principle from sigma 1 Ca, sigma 1 2 Ca, can be exploited to obtain some interesting results that are in this forthcoming paper for the review of symbolic logic. It's available in pre-proof on the site of the RSL. Let me just state two results. I don't want to get into details here, but just to give you a sense of the kind of results we're after. So one of the most acclaimed classical theorems of set theory is Zermelo's proof of the equivalence between the axiom of choice and the statement that every set can be well ordered. Given second-order logic's expressive resources, it is natural to ask whether second-order logic is strong enough to express and prove the result. However, while the property of well-ordering can be straightforwardly expressed in second-order logic, the existence of a covering function, such as that postulated by Zermelo, cannot be expressed in pure second-order logic. A proof of Zermelo's equivalence theorem can be given in third-order logic, where we have the ability to quantify over what are sometimes called type 2-1 functions, namely functions that take elements of the power set of the domain into the domain itself. In third-order logic, it is thus not difficult to prove the following. For every set X, there is a covering function for X, if and only if every set can be well ordered. But what if you don't have third-order logic? Notice that, like abstraction operators, choice functions also send monadic predicates to objects. For instance, Zermelo's covering function starts with a set M, whose well ordering is sought, and assigns to every non-empty set Z of M a distinguished element Z in Z. In other words, for each non-empty set M, and letting P of M star stand for all the non-empty sets of M, one postulates the existence of a gamma from PM star to M, such that for any Z in PM star, we have gamma Z is in Z. Now, let WOP be a typical statement in second order logic that every concept, actually this is an interesting thing, that every concept or the domain itself, in fact, has a well ordering. In this context, we introduce the following axioms that expresses that delta is a choice function on non-empty sets. Basically, it's simply for all X, if X is non-empty, then delta picks a representative element in that set. So here's what we prove in this forthcoming article. We show that by suitably introducing a symbol for a 2-1 choice function, so basically an abstract, an operator of the sort we are familiar with from Neologicism, with the axiom choice, we can prove the following, that second order logic plus choice proves the well-ordering property. And the second thing is that this is the best that can be done in the sense that second order logic plus choice is conservative over second order logic plus the well-ordering property. In order to understand this, the best that can be done is keep in mind that what the ideal would have been was show that the well-ordering property and choice are equivalent. But because the language of second-order logic is not as rich as that of third-order logic, where that equivalence could be shown, what actually happens in second-order logic is that W of P, the well-ordering property, turns out to be the strongest of the choice principles that you can formulate by a single formula in second-order logic. There are studies on this. So that the best that can be done here is, if you wanted an equivalence with choice, the best you can opt for is that choice doesn't increase the kind of things you can get, so only using second order logic and WOL or WOP, well-ordered property, with respect to formulas in the original language. And let me conclude. That was just a mention of some area of application. So among the consequences of these results are the following. First, HP is the only one among infinitely many principles that share exactly the same epistemic properties claimed for it by the neologicists. The good company it keeps puts pressure on its epistemic and ontological status. Second, the formal inconsistency of basic law 5 can be seen in the context of a wider family of formally refutable abstraction principles, i.e. abstraction principles whose main operator satisfies part all. In its badness, it is surrounded by a large group of similar rogues. Third, the neologist foundations of mathematics will never be able to implement a foundational approach which will vindicate the part all intuition on all its concepts, contrary to what the theory of numerosities achieves in a standard set theoretical foundational framework. Fourth, the combined effect of the two mentioned results on choice is that if we go beyond second order logic in a limited way, that is, the same way in which abstraction is neologicist theories, such as SOL plus Hume's principle, go beyond second order logic, then we obtain an implication from choice to well ordering, which is unavailable in pure second order logic. One way to put the result is a single choice function on the power set of the universe gives us a well ordering of all the possible concepts. Thus, our result is comparable to the statement of global choice. Finally, there are also some results in the foundational framework of reverse mathematics, showing that part-all principles can be refuted there too. However, I didn't have time to discuss this in the lectures. Here is the selected bibliography. Most importantly, this article with Ben Siskind that came out in the proceedings of the International Wittgenstein Symposium, and this new work with Stewart and with Benny. And that's it. Thank you very much.